Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org.
Neighbors, no one loves you like he loves you. And no one cares like he cares.
This week, we're sharing an interview with Talia Lavin, author of Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy. But in this chat, we speak about her more recent book, Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America. There's a lot in the book, most of it pretty disturbing, especially, I'm sure, for anyone who's ex-vangelical. And there is a discussion of hateful ideology and child abuse and corporal punishment, though not in lurid detail, so listener discretion is advised. We hope to cover related subjects in the future. The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
And welcome to The Child and Its Enemies, a podcast about queer and neurodivergent kids living out anarchy and youth liberation. Here at The Child and Its Enemies, we believe that youth autonomy is not only crucial to queer and trans liberation, but to anarchy itself. Governance is inherently based on projecting linear narratives of time and development and gender onto our necessarily asynchronous and atemporal queer lives. And youth and teens are at the center of this form of oppression. Our goal with the podcast is to create a space by and for youth that challenges all forms of control and inspires us to create queer, feral, ageless networks of care. I'm your host, MK Zariel. I'm 15 years old, and I'm the youth correspondent at the Anarchist Review of Books, author of Debate Me Bro, and organizer of some all-ages queer spaces in my city and online. If you want to learn more or join us on Discord and Signal, our website is thechildanditsenemies.noblogs.org.
Hi, so my name is Talia Lavin. She, her. I live in New York, and I am the author most recently of Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America, which came out late last year and, I think is unfortunately all too relevant in the current hellscape that we live in. I'm very happy to be here and to chat to your audience.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm sorry that you're here because of how important the book is, but I'm very happy to have you here to have the chat.
It's always, when you write like a book about sort of grim topics, like you have to delicately contend with a lot of situations like, your book gave me nightmares, but I'm so glad you wrote it. And I'm like, I'm so sorry that, or like, I wish your book wasn't so relevant. And I'm like, you and me both. But just kind of, if we have to live in a horrifying hellscape, like it's better to know your enemy and know the lay of the land, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. So your prior book, Culture Warlords, My Journey into the Dark Web of White Supremacy, covers white supremacists online and their online spaces and their meat space ramifications. What made you pivot to write your 2024 book, Wild Faith, about the Christian right in America? And was it much of a pivot, or did it sort of like lead well into the second book?
I was actually supposed to, the initial proposal was on sort of a history of terrorism in America. And then as I was looking through like histories of sort of American homegrown violence, and also looking at the ways the political landscape shifted between presidential elections, it became increasingly clear to me that while I learned a lot from studying these fringe groups and, from gaining a sort of working knowledge of anti-fascist movements and methods, I felt that if I really wanted to keep my audience appraised of radical right threats, that increasingly the vector of threat had moved from the radical fringe to, more or less the center. That there'd just been this radicalization of institutions. And that's part of the story. The other part is that I became very interested in child abuse within evangelical communities, which is something I focus on very heavily in the book. And child abuse and child rearing, but sort of systematically violent, as a vector for like the ways in which society can become more violent. So I spend a lot of time, some book critics have argued an inordinate amount of time kind of talking to survivors of child abuse, talking about, evangelical methods of child rearing. And to me, what's significant about it, I mean, first of all, it's always a privilege to, share, to have survivors share their stories with you. It's, oh my God, like so validating as a writer and author, just to be entrusted with these, really difficult stories that some people were telling, for the first time, let alone to, a total outsider. And so, but what I wound up kind of postulating, I suppose, is that a lot of the violence in American society, which I think we can all agree is a pretty hyper-violent place, I think can be traced back to really intergenerational trauma, really just these ways in which, there are a lot of subcultures, but particularly white evangelical parenting subculture is astoundingly violent. And I kind of wound up groping my way from there into kind of let's explain the last American half century and how did things get so amazingly, confusingly up. So yeah, it definitely turned in a different direction than I or my editor was expecting. But I felt that to not turn from the fringe to the mainstream would be to kind of marginalize my own understanding of just how drastically and quickly things at the very top and really at the sort of beating heart of American politics were changing.
It's kind of interesting, like, to talk about like turning from the fringe to the heart of American politics in that way, like to watch just over the last decade or so, Nazi groups, virulent white nationalist, white supremacist groups, like, or at least spokespeople from within those groups, sort of turning towards variant Christian sects, like in a lot of cases, becoming following certain trends in Eastern Orthodox churches, or becoming reactionary Catholics. They're following those trends, so it almost sort of, like a drop in the water that sort of like leads you to show, to see this sort of like back and forth feeding between not vocally Christian fringe, but also engaging a lot of the same value sets and a lot of the same like methods and approaches towards power, between, as you say, like the center of American politics and those fringes. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, totally. I mean, listen, you've got your trad caths and your, would be like Orthodox priests and so on in the far right, like in the sort of neo-Nazi sphere, and that they definitely exist. To me, that's much more an aesthetic phenomenon, sort of on par with the ways certain white supremacists will adopt, say, like Norse neo-paganism or Satanism or whatever. And it winds up being, kind of a way to be in community with fellow white supremacists, and more or less an aesthetic for your tattoos. I mean, I'm not a theologian. I'm not here to police anyone's expression of faith, but I think in many cases it doesn't really go necessarily beyond kind of, this is my flavor of how I express my hate. Whereas on the other hand, when you're talking about the Christian right as this political movement, it is quite a bit broader and numerically quite a bit larger than the neo-Nazi fringe, which is not to denigrate anyone who does that work. Like, I did that work. It's really hard. It's hard psychologically. It's hard emotionally. It's like involves, like getting door knocked by the FBI and being like, people want to rape and kill you. And you're like, oh, I know. And just all sorts of fun like that. And, the anti-fascist researchers I've known have been some of the most courageous and interesting people around. But for me, especially in, the contemporary Trump 2.0 era, it began to feel a little narrow. Like, and also, these sort of fascist movements, particularly the alt-right movement, really became, I watched them become victims of their own success. Their ideas so successfully penetrated the mainstream that it no longer made sense to study them kind of in, not in absentia, but like in isolation, and to not be talking about the ways their ideas are influencing the main cast of characters in American politics right now. Like, you look at the ideology I studied in, when I was looking at incels in, Culture Warlords in 2020. And then when I read about, the Christian right's stated goals for women in 2025, like, to me, the picture is far more similar than it is different, even if it's couched in different terminology and, uses different proof texts. Maybe it's not the 14 words, maybe it's the Book of Paul, but, the essential, idea of dominating, controlling, subverting, and destroying, like, women's freedom is still there and is still at the core of the ideology.
Yeah, thank you. So there are a few terms that you use in the book that are common today, but the boundaries and overlaps, I think, are worth investigating. And so, like, what is the Christian right that you describe in the book? How is that distinguished from Christian nationalism? Like, who do these terms cover, and what beliefs do they share? How widespread are they?
I mean, the categories are a little bit blurry. So, I mean, the Christian right is like a group of people, whereas Christian nationalism is an ideology. So you can have Christian nationalists who are, very often part of the Christian right, but one is sort of a noun about an ideology, and another is a noun about the group of people that perpetuate it. So that's one answer, maybe not the sexiest answer in the world, but there you have it. And then in terms of understanding how widespread it is and what are the numbers. So in my book, I focused a lot on white evangelical Protestants, and that number is pretty well established. It's right around 14 million people. So not the largest group in the US, but certainly not small. And it's a group that's also been, when I talk about the Christian right, I'm talking about people who are sort of the direct spiritual descendants of these kind of titans of the movement that emerged in the 70s and 80s. People like Billy Graham and Jerry Falwell that, younger listeners very well may not have any knowledge of. But, essentially these televangelist titans who started these organizations like the Moral Majority and Focus on the Family, and really proclaim themselves as the arbiters of American morality. And so all that stuff about kind of Christians being the guardians of the American family and decency, that's not like, yes, Christian morality in a sort of Christian hegemonic country has always had this outsized role. But the idea of American Christianity really being this force for social conservatism and explicitly also a major force in right-wing politics is really something that's been building over the last 50 years. And what we're seeing now in the Trump administration is, the sort of apotheosis of that. This patient view to eternity kind of building of temporal power. And we're seeing the results play out in real time, the judicial capture, the wild amount of power over state legislatures. And that is just, I don't see that necessarily going away anytime soon. So in the interim, it's I would argue it's a defensive tactic to understand what these groups believe and where they're coming from. And also, there is a certain tendency, particularly among liberal commentators, to say, well, no, they can't. These folks can't really believe these things that I personally find abhorrent, right? There's this sense of sort of, well, everyone kind of secretly believes in this sort of secular, rational worldview at their core, rationalistic, right, worldview at their core. Everyone has a kind of scientific skepticism that they approach belief with. And that is just, sort of fundamentally not the case. People, but especially people in the media, really tend to look at this kind of belief as sort of either a cynical grift or a comic sideshow. And it can be comic and it can often be grotesque. But I think at your own peril, do you sort of, one's own peril, you say, well, they can't possibly really believe that anyone who politically opposes them is the tool of the devil. Like, no, they absolutely can. And, I've often found that, I certainly found in my research on neo-Nazis, that the biggest single clue to figuring out what a group of people believes, if you, earnestly want to do that, is to read what they have to say about what they believe. It's just this one weird trick, is just kind of reading what they write, especially to one another in community. And the evangelical right has a lot to say about the ways it wants to see America run, the ways it wants women and gay people to have roles in public life, aka minimal or not at all. The ways it views women and work and welfare and all sorts of things. And you are currently seeing many of those policy prescriptions being played out under the Trump administration, which is both very frightening and also, to me, at any rate, like a significant impetus to really dig down and get to know like who these folks are and why they want what they want. And so I did a lot of reading of stuff like Christian marriage manuals and Christian parenting manuals and, like Christian relationship blogs and so on and so forth. So you don't have to. I did that. And so, I cite my sources. You can read them if you want. But, it's kind of like they're not hiding what they want. It's not a hidden agenda in any way. It's very open. You just have to have the capacity to say, boy, yeah, these are ideas that they truly believe and very much want to implement on a national level.
There's also, like you mentioned, about listening to what people say and believing that especially when they're talking to each other, that they're being honest, and this is a good way of appraising the intentions and possibly like doing a threat analysis of where they're going. And I think that people, especially with like what might be called like a liberal humanist gaze, might scoff at like, okay, well, they might, believe, okay, they want women in the, in the kitchens and pregnant, barefoot, all that, out of the workplaces, this sort of stuff. And terrible as that is, they might also scoff at the, understand that and say, okay, well, this is something that feminism's been fighting for a long time. This we can understand. But when it comes to some of the spiritual ideas, some of the eschatology, or some of the what's the term I'm looking for? It's probably too complicated, so I shouldn't try to say it. The like idea of spiritual warfare, basically the framing that a lot of people in the Christian right have towards the implications of the outcomes of the struggles that they're in. Like, it's not just about keeping women out of the workplace. It's not just about taking away their right to choose when to have children, but it might be about the struggle against demons, or one of your opponents being actually like taken over by Satan, and that the end of the world and the second coming of Christ are right around the corner. If we just do the right things, we can survive to see it or participate. I thought that was an important part of the book, that like a point that you've brought up a couple times, and you also have brought it up in a few interviews that you've done, of just like, you don't have to believe it too, but understanding that someone does, that these are the scales on which people are judging their activity, often like sometimes their terrorism, is what's at stake is beyond what the courts will adjudicate correctly. It's in the hands of God. Can you talk a bit about some of the shortcomings of this, like, again, I'm going to say, and you might have a different name for it, but like liberal humanist or science driven like approach towards understanding opposition, what's at stake, and also what people are willing to do to get done what they think has divine ramifications?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you already kind of nailed it when you said like the stakes are very high in this culture. They're ramped up to this degree that's so intense that it's sort of hard to imagine the stakes getting any higher, because functionally they are about how to bring about Jesus's return, how to thwart Lucifer in a perpetual war of the spirit that's like constantly going on just outside the mortal realm, often in these, incredibly, if you look at like the visions coming out of the 70s and 80s, and if you look at the prophecy movement and, charismatic Christianity in all sorts of ways, there's really a sense that the battle for Christian souls and Christian virtue is really like this sort of very literal battle between angels and demons that's taking place in the American public sphere. That like angels and demons not only have a place in the American political sphere, but like they're already there. And so the warriors of light are just, are doing this like incredibly important job of literally sort of being God's messengers and warriors within like the world. And so when you posit that the stakes are, the world, like the end is nigh, right? And we can make it nigher, which is something we want, depending on our actions, right? So that's sort of step one in this sort of belief. And then, step two is, okay, what we're doing is thwarting the devil and bringing back Jesus, and anyone who stands in our way is standing on the wrong side of God. So that it becomes very existential very quickly. It really becomes about this battle between good and evil. The stakes are extremely high. And you're really playing with, demonic fire or whatever really quickly. And that's something that can be very hard to assimilate as someone who's secular. Like, you're like, I don't believe in any of this stuff. This isn't my worldview. So how can it have such a massive impact on politics when it's so alien to me? But once you understand that these are the stakes for the people involved, some of the extremity of their actions makes a lot more sense. And I think that has value. And it's also, worth knowing that you've been more or less drafted into a spiritual war that started way before you were born, for most of our listeners, and, will continue with or without you. It's just that you're on the devil's side, whether you signed up for it or not. So you've been enlisted into the army of the unrighteous because you disagree with the Christian rights stances on stuff like gay marriage and, gay people existing, and trans folks, should be able to go to the bathroom, and really wild stuff like that. So that, we talk about culture war all the time in American media, and it's very often this kind of irritating shorthand for like, well, this group believes in civil rights and this group doesn't. I'm like, let's call it a culture war. And that's always been kind of irritating to me, just because I think it's kind of a dishonest, belittling framing of these issues that are so vitally important to so many people. But even beyond that, it's not even a culture war. It's like a clash of fundamental worldviews. Like, do you believe that your actions are led and driven by like the Prince of Darkness and his minions or not? To call that a culture war, I think, is a bit reductive.
Like, you had mentioned a few thinkers that were influential to the formation of the Christian right as it stands now. And I'd love to sort of pick at some of that and get some more names in a moment. But so I grew up Roman Catholic, not all that devout, but the determination of like what's, most of the determination of the discussion is decided by the Vatican. It's decided by the central authority. And there's some sort of orthodoxy in the interpretation of, these books that are included, the so-called Bible or whatever. And I get the impression that, and maybe this is the like ex-Catholic looking at the Protestant movements, that like decision-making for what is scripture and how the interpretation should be is a really decentralized thing. And so with the Christian right, like, are there any movers or shakers currently that are helping to determine these stakes and determine these interpretations that are being shared? Like, it's not just the Southern Baptist Conference, right?
That's a pretty big influential group, Southern Baptist Convention. But no, it's not just them. Like, one sort of big watershed moment was I don't know what to call it, petition declaration called the Manhattan Declaration. And it was signed during the Obama years. And it was, like hundreds of pastors from across different denominations essentially signing this proclamation that they would not obey laws that conflicted with their Christian faith as they interpreted it. And you had people from all sorts of denominations, Catholics, Orthodox, all kinds of folks, but, primarily white evangelical Protestants. And essentially it was an argument against being, quote unquote, forced to recognize gay marriage, being sort of forced, like all about this sort of gender ideology that they hold very dearly, about one man and one woman, and the woman is submissive to the man. It's funny, like they talk all the time about, everyone else is indoctrinating via gender ideology, and then they have this like incredibly rigid indoctrination via gender ideology. So these are figures like John Piper. These were really like leaders from all over the modern sort of right. And there is a very significant Catholic element in the modern Christian right. It is huge. Leonard Leo, the leader of the Federalist Society, I believe is Catholic. And, you've got Amy Coney Barrett on the court, and J.D. Vance with his sort of, I'm a Catholic convert, far-righter vibes. And so, there is not to mention some of the OGs, like Phyllis Schlafly was Catholic. She was this female warrior against women's rights, and really can unfortunately take a lot of credit for defeating the Equal Rights Amendment. So terrible job on that, Phyllis.
Or Father Conklin.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's really going far back, but sure, yeah. That was a priest who basically did a lot of anti-Semitism and racism on air. Like might have lately had a paramilitary, that sort of thing, during the 30s. There's always been a Catholic right. In the 80s, there was really a quite savvy decision to bind the Catholic and Protestant right together into a, I would say, Protestant-led, but sort of mutually beneficial movement, focusing on abortion and restricting abortion and reproductive rights. The sort of white Protestant right really awoke politically in the wake of Brown versus Board of Education, and also subsequent Supreme Court decisions that argued, in essence, that segregated religious schools could not be tax exempt. So, famous decisions involving like Bob Jones University, but also lots of other parochial schools across the South that you haven't heard of that were so-called segregation academies. So that, after Brown versus Board passed, there's this really wild movement of just an emptying out of public schools across the South, bleeding funds from public schools, just withdrawing, all white students withdrawing, and then this rash of Christian schools cropping up to fill, the void for white students and white students only. And so, if you looked at NAACP reports at the time, they said the quickest way to identify a segregation academy is to see if it has church or Christian in its name. And so, like, the initial political awakening of the Christian right was this violent segregationism centered on schools. You can still see echoes of that in the way their rhetoric is constantly about protecting the children, and the ways their rhetoric and actions are so hyper-focused on and deeply hostile to public schools. I mean, that really comes from the founding DNA of this movement. But essentially what you had in the 80s were some savvier political operators like Paul Weyrich and Phyllis Schlafly saying, hey guys, okay, we get that you're passionate about segregation. We don't disagree, but it's not going to win you a lot of converts outside the South and outside your congregations. It makes you look unsympathetic to, the Americans who have sort of reluctantly decided, okay, let's give, some semblance of racial equality a try. And so what essentially emerged out of the mid to late 70s and 80s was this new coalition of the moral majority, the Christian right, who became hyper-focused on kind of repealing feminism and gay rights and reproductive rights and all of these movements that had sort of defined the 60s and this sort of decade in which there was a real backlash against segregation, against, all these values that these groups really held dear and felt very fundamentally about. And so, what sort of emerged was the sense of like, okay, let's attack it from a different perspective. If we're going to defeat feminism, we've got to frame this as like, we are enacting a civil rights movement of our own, a struggle for the civil rights of the unborn. And the movement very quickly started adopting the language of the very civil rights movement that they had, so recently literally like turned the hoses on. It was the sense of like, this time we'll be on the right side of history. And really the sense of just, well, okay. And so one thing that's interesting to me and that I do bring up in the book is that most of these movements that led to the sense of violent dislocation and, this backlash that really awakened white Protestants as a political force for the first time in modern American history. Many of these protest movements, whether we're talking about, gay rights, whether we're talking about feminism, and whether we're talking about, civil rights, many of these were led, ending the war in Vietnam, all of it, right? All of these movements were led by young people and students. And so what you have also emerge at the same time is this biblical parenting movement that advocates for extremely harsh, punitive, and controlling parenting, really brutal ideological indoctrination. You have the rise and subsequent sort of meteoric legislative success of the homeschooling movement. And so essentially what you have is this really intense movement from within the Christian right to control the youth. The sense of the youth is out of control. The youth is causing, all of these movements that we find morally abhorrent and socially disruptive. And so we're going to develop this method of parenting that is so harsh and so punitive that it is essentially rebellion proof. Now, I talked to a lot of folks who left those milieus, but leaving those milieus is really hard and fraught with pain, in large part because the indoctrination is so complete, because the abuse is so physical and also so scarring mentally. And, also when you leave, as I know personally from growing up an Orthodox Jew and leaving it, when you leave a totalizing faith and a faith community, you leave behind a lot of really great stuff that's really lacking in American society writ large. You leave behind the meal trains when you're sick. You leave behind these sort of instant casual connections you can create within a faith community into the sort of atomizing and unknown loneliness of contemporary America. It can be a very jarring and alienating transition, and it was for a lot of people I spoke to.
Yeah, I think that's a really important insight, and I think that invites us as people who envision alternatives to that society, and as people that envision alternatives to not just the goals of those like theocratic movements or whatever, but recognize the alienation of the society that we're in. I guess maybe that gives us some clues as to things that we should, build into how we form community here, how we welcome people out of those experiences, people who have come out of evangelical or other sorts of like repressive communities that are totalizing, like how could we take the good out of those and invite people into, because people are, even as adults who grew up in this more fragmented neoliberal society of individuals, like they get drawn towards totalizing movements that give them the answers and make them feel love bombed, or even just help them take care of the day to day that's so difficult under under capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, are you doing a better job of making people feel less alone and more taken care of and helped out, you know, than movements that are all about like brimstone and hellfire and how like trans people are an abomination unto God, right? Like, and I'm not saying that like no amount of potluck suppers make up for that being your central message. What I am saying is what people gain from those communities is a sense of certainty and of purpose and of community, a sense that they're not alone in the universe, and also often like babysitting and help with childcare and like, you know, meals when they're sick. Like, what are we doing to reproduce that sort of hands-on care in our communities? You know, I don't know that we are doing such like as good a job as we could. Although I know a lot of leftists who are engaged in mutual aid efforts in very direct, open, and wonderful ways. It's just, it is a challenge. And I think we're all so used to kind of our loneliness being a subject of like private shame, like, and not something you're supposed to admit. You're always supposed to be doing fine. And, you know, who among us is doing like fine right now? I mean, I think a lot of us are struggling, and a lot of us are sort of needlessly carrying the burden of that struggle alone, when it's like all of us are carrying the same weight. And it might be lighter together, or even just knowing that you're carrying that weight of despair or alienation or displacement in company is something that, you know, can, you know, even if you just want to be purely utilitarian, can be a defensive tactic for our communities against, you know, movements that are predatory and have fundamentally antisocial goals. I think sometimes we take out our emotions on sort of testing and raging at one another because we feel powerless in the grand scheme of things. And it's a lot easier to yell at the Trotskyist next door for not being insufficiently ideologically pure than it is to sort of comprehend one's own like utter like impotence in the face of ascendant Christofascism. I don't know. But I'm not like here to be like what the left is doing wrong. It's more just like when you look at why it's so hard for people to leave movements that have like led them to be beaten from literally before they could talk. You know, a lot of times, you know, first of all, there's the sort of natural human desire to like please your parents and stay close to home. You know, it takes a lot of really tough questions to yourself and about yourself and what you've been taught that not everyone is inclined to do. But you also do pay quite a heavy price to leave. And I think that price might be reduced if there was more care and more attention paid to people who have not only left these movements, but often are some of the loudest voices against these movements that have some really totalizing and really painful goals for all of us.
Yeah, it seems to me like one thing I really did appreciate about the book was, I think Molly Conger maybe pointed out that like or maybe you pointed out in the conversation with Molly Conger that like the whole second half of the book is around, or part 2, I guess, is around like less about the historical movement, although you're bringing in all of this documentation, but about the impacts on people. And a lot of it, as you said, like talking to people that survived and have moved beyond and given you these interviews or these insights, which I think like hearing from the person that is affected by the thing, you're going to get the most insight. It's not only like a sign of respect for someone who's willing to open up that part of themselves, but yeah, they oftentimes are going to be the best source. Yeah,
I mean, they also know the tactics inside out, right? Like they know the language, they know the tactics, they know the lies that they were taught to tell. So, talking to ex-evangelicals, yeah, like it is about respect for like testimonies of abuse, and I don't want to minimize that part of it, but it also just makes a lot of strategic sense. If you're like, like these are people who are like, hello, like we're inside this movement. It is evil and we want to fight it. And like, they are the first people and the loudest people to tell you like, yes, these folks really do believe that you're an agent of Lucifer. And like, they really believe that they're the only ones who are on the right side of Satan, and they will fight accordingly because those are the stakes.
Yeah. Can you talk about about what some of them have said about what those sort of pressures, the pressures to fall within the vision of what it means to be a boy or a man, a woman or a wife or a girl, a child, like the sort of framing and physical like reformation and pain that was applied to people, and how they've come out of, like how they go about unlearning some of that? Because that was pretty powerful for me to read some of those personal statements.
Yeah, I mean, just before that, I do want to say like one thing I think that distinguishes this book from, there are many books on Christian nationalism, and I'm so glad. Like, the more the merrier, really. Like, it's such a pernicious and widespread phenomenon that I just think, there really can't be enough books, exploring this threat. But most of them are by Christians, which I am not and never have been and never will be. And so often what you see, particularly in like from a liberal Christian perspective, is the sense of like they're doing Jesus wrong. And that's sort of the primary complaint. Like you often see this sort of, they're not real Christians as a real like primary complaint against, sort of Trumpist Christian pastors and members of the MAGA movement who are prominently Christian and so forth. Whereas for me, like, that's not, I don't care. Like, just fundamentally, like, I'm not here to defend Jesus's brand. I don't have my own personal Jesus that I carry around in my pocket to like rebuke people with. I'm just like, okay, cool. So you have this faith inflected vision of what you want America to be. And this is what Christianity means to you. I'm like, I'm not here to question it. I'm not a theologian, and I'm not gonna, debate who has a better version of Christianity than whom. What I want to know is like, what is being done in the name of God and why? Like, what's the internal reasoning here? So, but at the same time, I grew up Orthodox. I grew up, in a world where my life was organized around faith. What I ate, how, going to school, half my school day was conducted like in Hebrew, right? And so that when people talked about, the degree of influence and control like faith and religious institutions had over their lives, I didn't have that kind of like secular journalist, like, whoa, are you serious? That in and of itself is crazy. I'm like, okay, no, that makes sense to me as like a former, super religious kid. But let's talk about what that looked like. And what did it look like? I mean, yeah, there were some really, really strict ideas about what being a girl meant, what being a boy meant, and what being like a child meant. So I read dozens of Christian marriage and parenting manuals spanning from, the 70s to, or earlier to quite recent ones. Some of the manuals I looked at were from the 2010s or even early 2020s. And what really struck me was the hyper focus on obedience. Obedience as sort of the chief virtue of a child, the chief virtue of a wife, the chief virtue of a Christian, where the husband, I mean, it's a very literalized patriarchy. It's this real intense kind of like the husband rules the family, and then, God rules the husband, and the woman and man, like each rule the children. Like it's this quite, there are these literal diagrams like depicting, the hierarchy of the biblical family and so on. And yeah, I mean, to me, it felt very like alien and intense, but it is sort of it was useful in the sense that it was the subtext of so much of Republican rhetoric just laid bare. But also the degree of violence prescribed in the parenting manuals was astounding. I mean, you were instructed to beat your children in many cases, like, and we're talking pretty mainstream, like best-selling manuals that sold, over 1 million copies in some cases, like James Dobson, may he rest in hell. When he gets there, he's still alive. In his books, Dare to Discipline being the first and most prominent, but also The Strong-Willed Child. The strong-willed child, just to be clear, is a bad thing, and you want to beat the strong will out of them. These are prescriptions for intense, ritualized physical violence against children as young as 15 months old. Some of the more sociopathic parenting manuals, like To Train Up a Child by Michael and Debbie Pearl, prescribe, starting even earlier, like when children are infants. And it sort of comes from this worldview that sort of mankind is inherently sinful, that even an infant is crying, like the child is prey to like the frailties of the flesh. I mean, so like a baby is crying not because it's helpless or hungry, but because it is like inherently subject to the like frailties of the flesh and the evils of man. I mean, really intense stuff. And the marriage manuals are really all about how to submit yourself, how to submit yourself completely to your husband. And everything in these manuals, every unhappiness, up to and including in some of the more extreme ones, like physical abuse, most of these manuals have sort of a kind of cover your ass disclaimer about physical abuse. So like, get out if he's abusing you. But, with everything else, it's just like, yeah, obey your husband, even if he makes you unhappy, even if his commands are like less competent than you would be at managing the household. Like the natural God-given order of things is that you as a woman should submit, and therefore feminine submission is necessary. And if you are in pain, if you hate your husband and you hate your marriage, like submit harder. There isn't really an alternative method. And, there's a lot of literature and reporting like bearing out the sort of disastrous ways this kind of totalizing ideology of submission is played out in churches and in marriages. And a lot of people I talked to who had escaped the church had also been encouraged to marry very young and had entered into abusive relationships and had been physically abused their entire, youthful lives, and simply did not have either the language or the capacity to leave an abusive relationship because it was abusive. And so that was a really sad piece of it, the way that physical abuse as a child can lead to relational dysfunction as an adult. I mean, it's a pretty one-to-one kind of scenario.
Well, so just to point to a specific thing that you underline in the book, the ramifications I think are which are pretty stark. You discuss the rhetoric of parental rights. You quote statistics about legal marriage of children as young as 10 years old with parental approval, to others, often girls married to grown men in the U.S. And if that weren't enough, to the inaccessibility of no-fault divorce to children who were sorted into arranged marriages. Can you talk about that nexus?
Yeah, I mean, it's really messed up, right? Like, it's just, you don't think about it, and then once you know about it, you kind of can't unknow it. But like hundreds of thousands of like underage girls are married off to adult men every single year. It is just a pretty routine thing that happens, because what you need for that to happen is parental consent. And if your parents are all in on an ideology that more or less views you as a tradable commodity slash baby factory slash obedience school trainee graduate, there's a lot of child marriage that happens in the US. A lot, like way too much, like disturbing. I mean, there's no amount that I'm like, that would be fine. But we're not even talking about like the Romeo and Juliet, kind of like 17 and 18-year-olds getting married because they're just two crazy kids who can't wait, right? It's like 12-year-olds marrying like men in their 30s or 40s, and as long as you have parental consent, it's fine. And yeah, it happens often under the aegis of like religious institutions. And I mean, it's just another example of the stunning laxity of American laws around, like, whenever the words religious freedom, which, religious liberty, incidentally, as a movement, like really directly arose out of the pro-segregation religious schools movement in, the era immediately following like Jim Crow. So that's where that term comes from. It's a brilliant marketing coup, recast. It's like literally their freedom is the unfreedom of others, and that's just how it's been for a long time. Their freedom is the freedom to exclude like Black people from their schools. That's where it started, and then it, got some nice additions, like the freedom of to not have to live in a society where women can control their own bodies, the freedom to never get divorced. Like, the word freedom can be really twisted around in all sorts of ways, where their notion of liberty, or what they might call liberty, is fundamentally a story about restricting the freedom of other people. Like that, Kim Davis, the court clerk who became this sort of Christian martyr figure for refusing to validate like a gay couple's marriage license, right? Like her quote unquote religious freedom was not letting some other folks get married. And that's this marquee case, and she raised tons of money, and it was literally all about restricting other people's freedom. Like quite literally being like, you can't get married. And she's the sort of poster child of religious freedom. And I think that tells you quite a bit. I mean, there's so much I can say. It's a long book, but the staggering focus on obedience and the sort of monoculture of thought really threw me. I mean, that was something that I was, let's say, like not super familiar or comfortable with. And, the physical violence to ensure obedience, and then subsequently these hyper obedient Christian children become used as a means of sort of propaganda. Like people talked about like being taken to the park and sort of shown off as these examples of like kids that didn't cry and kids that didn't have tantrums and kids that didn't, embarrass their parents because they were good Christian children. And this was a tool of like witnessing is a very popular term. It's, it's a way of, demonstrating faith to the faithless and so on. And ultimately what's so disconcerting, I mean, in addition to just like the sheer amount of violence that props all that up, is also just like that this is very explicitly a goal, not just for Christian communities, but for the entire United States. Like this is a theocratic movement that wants to see a theocratic government. And, because their freedom is the unfreedom of others, like wants to impose this very specific and, to my mind, extremely damaging and frightening like set of values on America not just, we want to live separately in our own communities and, that's bad enough. Like, it's not like these are abuse-free havens, but no, like it's not sufficient. It's about like, we want to impose this incredibly rigid view of gender, view of childhood, view of sexuality on the entire United States. Whether you have a different faith or none, it doesn't matter. Like, you are, it's the faith militant, right? It's a conquering faith, and America is going to be a Christian kingdom, whether we like it or not. Like, those are their goals. They're very total. They're not messing around. And so I think it's worth at least knowing that, sort of countering it with a sort of similar energy for like the right to be cacophonous and messy and non-obedient and ourselves.
Yeah, that sounds like a good place to start from, for sure.
I mean, it's a trickier message because, it's not onward Christian soldiers marching in a line, but, okay, so we march to lots of different drums.
So I feel a little embarrassed to admit that I've been rewatching The Handmaid's Tale in preparation for the new 5th season that came out, or that's coming out. But the representation of gender roles, the question of divorce, concept of childbearing and child rearing, rights and the role of the child, and the murder of queerness in Gilead feel really pertinent when thinking about the vision of many close to power in the U.S. these days. I wonder how you feel about how this work of fiction, whether it be the books or the TV series, which feels a little more accessible, like how they compare to the visions put forth by many of the subjects of your book.
Yeah, I mean, I stopped watching after season 1 just because at a certain point I was like, oh man, it's
really rapey.
Yeah, it's like, especially when I was doing research for this book, I'm like, really, I'm going to watch this on my free time? But it's worth noting that, like, it is not a coincidence that Margaret Atwood wrote this book in 1985. Like, she was writing it in direct response to the rise of the Christian right. Serena Joy is based on, I think it's Tammy Faye Bakker, who was like a specific female televangelist at the time. Like, there are real world analogs in the moral majority, in the Christian right figures at the time who were militantly anti-feminist and militantly anti-queer. And so, it's interesting that, like, the TV show came out now, but the ideas come straight out of the 80s and have just been building and building and building and building their power ever since. Like, if we live in Gilead, it's not because we weren't warned, like that Gilead was being built all around us. Atwood is just one of a lot of voices who've been saying, like, it is worth listening to what they have to say about what they believe and following it to its logical conclusion, which is essentially a form of enslavement for anyone with female genitalia and an erasure of queerness from public life. And we're seeing that happen, like, right in front of our eyes. So the reason why her writing feels so prescient and so, oh my God, I can't believe she predicted that, is because what she was looking at and then basing her dystopia on, like, were the people she was seeing on TV and in the papers, right? Who were openly saying, like, yeah, we want to take away women's bodily agency and we will absolutely set off bombs and perform acts of terrorism in order to make that happen, right? Like, the 80s and 90s were the site of some incredibly brutal crimes against abortion clinics and, providers. Like, the guy who bombed the 1996 Olympics was also a clinic bomber. Like, countless arsons, stalkings, murders, like, the anti-abortion terror movement, the sort of manifestation of Gilead at that time was incredibly violent and incredibly successful, ultimately. Like, what you have in the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the continual chipping away and surveillance of women's bodies is a terror movement that worked in conjunction with, legislators and made being a provider of particularly late-term abortions physically dangerous that it became rare because there was a solid chance you might get murdered. And now tens of millions of American women cannot get abortions. And their goal is all American women can't get abortions. I mean, these goals are very stark, but they've been laying them out since the 80s. Like, they've been in the public sphere for a long time. And this sort of unwillingness to listen, and frankly, the undue deference that is given to the Christian right and any Christian movement in a Christian country, which America is, hegemony is a powerful drug. That's why The Handmaid's Tale feels so pertinent.
In your book and subsequent interviews, you explore Alice Miller's study on authoritarianism around World War II Germany, on the role of brutal regimentation, corporal punishment, and the generational impact on empathy that paved the way towards the Shoah. If children are the future, what futurity does the Christian right envision for humanity and their own kids?
I mean, in many ways, what we're seeing now, this kind of Christo-fascism, which I define as everything being about the power of the hyper-centralized mono ideology state. I think what we are seeing now is the fruits of the biblical parenting movement that has been going on and growing again since the 1980s. So that the people I talked to about the trauma of this kind of upbringing ranged from 22 to folks in their 60s. This has been going on for a very long time, that these ideas have been in American homes and at American kitchen tables and leading to American children getting spanked for expressing independent thought. And so, yeah, Alice Miller, in her book, For Your Own Good, she studies like early 20th century German pedagogy and, like me, read a lot of unpleasant parenting manuals. She was a German Jewish psychologist who survived the Holocaust and subsequently wrote a book about it. It spends a great deal of time psychoanalyzing Adolf Hitler, which is not something I'm as gung-ho about. But what she does do that I think is really interesting and unique is she goes through these German parenting manuals from the turn of the 20th century, i.e. the people that would have been in their 30s and the 30s, right? And I mean, reading them was just like, oh my God, this could be straight out of any of the evangelical parenting manuals I was reading at the same time. I mean, the similarities were remarkable in the sense that, yeah, it was all about obedience, instant, joyous obedience, enacted through physical punishment. And the sort of ritualistic nature of the corporal punishment, the ways in which you are instructed to beat your child, for their own good, right? In order to make them a better citizen, a better Christian, a better, person. And this implication that should you not enact brutal physical violence against your own child, you would be neglecting them. In the Christian context, it's literally you are condemning them to hell if you don't render them sufficiently obedient to yourself and then to God. Yeah, I mean, it's really dark stuff, right? I mean, if I sound like it's a bummer, it's because it's a bummer, right? But what she says is that the kind of people who are, who grow up inured to pain, who grow up empathizing with the pain giver rather than the pain receiver, because to do otherwise would mean condemning your own upbringing and condemning your parents, which is a hard thing for most folks to do. So people who grow up that way, she says, these people make the best torturers. And that really stuck with me. That you become so thoroughly identified with the person who has beaten you and enacted cruelty on you that for you, cruelty becomes a natural ground state of being. And I think that we really see that playing out in sort of gleeful responses to violence that are taking place, you know, in response to deportations, in response to, you know, the increasingly violent tactics of, you know, ICE, and also in this persistent evangelical obsession with kind of comparing Trump to a punitive father who's like here to come discipline America, right? And this is viewed as like a great thing, a healthy thing, wholesome for the country. We need punishment. And, you know, I think that speaks more eloquently to the cycle of depravity than anything I can say.
Talia Lavin, thank you so much for the time, for writing this book, and for having this chat with me. I really appreciate it. Are you working on any things you want to mention right now that people should keep an eye on, or any social media presences or a website that folks should check out to keep up?
Yeah, I mean, right now I'm primarily on Blue Sky just because I got really fed up with Twitter under the reign of Musk. And so I'm there at Swords Jew, and I write a newsletter called The Sword and the Sandwich. You might sense a theme, where I write about both the far right and American politics. Lately, it's been a lot about the kind of Make America Healthy Again movement and its flirtation with eugenics. And also I write about food. I write about sandwiches. So you can find that on Button Down, or just search The Sword and the Sandwich and it'll come right up.
Awesome. Thank you. I'll make sure to link both of those in the show notes, as well as where people can find the books.
Okay. Thank you so much. And I really appreciate you taking the time to have this long, involved, thoughtful conversation with me and these great questions. You know, I never wondered for a second if you'd read the book, which was lovely.
That's good. Yeah. It was a hell of a read. It was definitely some dark times, but I appreciate you wading through it and pulling out the diamonds. And now some words from Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
Hey, sports fans, welcome back to the latest match in the Nuclear Holocaust Showdown. I'm your ringside host, Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain, and it looks like we're in great competition today. It's a little hot here in the Middle East, a little humid. I even say it's downright balmy. Excuse me. As I see, we have an intense nuclear stare-down happening in the ring between Zionist authoritarian Bibi Netanyahu and his arch-nemesis, the Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mola. The rubble has been piling up for several days, and the two principal combatants have barely broken a sweat. They've been rehydrating on Hierarch Insanity energy drinks, sponsor of this match. Hierarch Insanity energy drinks, both kosher and halal. Hierarch Insanity, the preferred energy drinks of most angry gods. So far, the Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mola and his corner men have been pretty subdued during the course of the match, not really tipping their hands as to strategy. You've got Punchy and Killer Kim staying limber. Kim, by the way, is Kim Jong-un, not to be confused with another Kim who has a popular reality show with her sisters. Punchy Putin has been greatly distracted with his own grappling match in Eastern Europe, and it's not unreasonable to question how much gas he's got left in the tank to help out his pal Ayatollah. Kim, on the other hand, has been out of the spotlight for a considerable time. He looks fresh. He looks down to about 300 pounds, his optimum fighting weight. He could perhaps tag in at any time. In the opposite corner, waving a towel at Star David, we've got Spray Tan Trump, who has proven to be quite the wild card in all of this. In fact, in the tradition of Don King, Trump is both the manager of the Zionist fighter and the promoter of the bout. Some have been critical of his conflict of interest. Safe to say, none of this could have happened without him. He's been angling for this match for years. He's the guy who tore up the Ayatollah contract and dragged himself out of retirement. It's the fight that his buddy Bibi has been dying for, chomping at the bit to climb in the ring. For Bibi, it's personal. He intends to teach the Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mola to stop talking smack about his home country, which, by the way, was stolen from somebody else in 1948. 1940s, that's where the story converges between Zionist Beebe and his spray-tan corner man waiting to star David Powell and messing up the bird's nest atop his head. It was Trump's predecessor, Harry Dasher Truman, who elevated the fight game to start with, hiring the world's most revered trainer, Oppenheimer, to help him really beef up against the tag team champs of Hitler and Hirohito. So with Oppenheimer's plans, Harry the Haberdasher put the smackdown on his opponents, but the cat was out of the bag. The game went to a whole new level. Totally nuclear. Since the 1940s, it's gone crazy cray-cray with everybody trying to beef up and throw weight around. One of Beebe's predecessors even spied on Trump's predecessor in order to get the secret formula for nuclear success. But you can see by Trump's enthusiasm for Beebe, all that skullduggery has long been forgotten. So, back to the action. Beebe's got the Ayatollah in a chokehold, and it looks like, yes, the Donald has tagged in. I don't think the Ayatollah saw the tag. This is the Donald's first time back in the ring since he beat former champ Stormy Daniels. The Donald climbs up to the top turnbuckle. Oh, that's a 30,000-pound hammer drop if I've ever seen one. The Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mole appears to be dazed. Can he come back from this one? He looks to be turning back to his corner. Punchy Putin has his hand extended. But what's that? His hand isn't empty. That looks like cesium-137 and strontium-90. If the Ayatollah gets his hands on that, he'll certainly be fighting dirty. And that could be curtains for all of his opponents. And there's Kim back up on the apron. He's been using his T-shirt cannon to lob some packages into the drink. It looks like he's extending the T-shirt cannon to the Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mole. That could be a game changer if the Ayatollah gets his hands on Kim's advanced pack. Don't call him Rocket Man for nothing. Meanwhile, Beebe and the Donald are busy high-fiving and fist-pumping. It's a pretty impassioned embrace. Way too much display of affection. The crowd's going crazy for them, but the adulation is quite distracting them. The referee didn't count out the Ayatollah of Whack-A-Mole. The Ayatollah hasn't tapped. In fact, he's getting close to his corner, where him and Punchy are both extending their hands and, the light in the arena just went out. Complete darkness. And the water. All the utilities. Looks like a cyber attack has crippled the arena. We'll wait here for a commercial break, and you'll just have to stay tuned to see how this nuclear Holocaust showdown ends. Sunday Nuclear Holocaust Showdown, brought to you by the Hierarch Insanity Energy Drink. When you watch Nuclear Holocaust Showdown, think Hierarch Insanity. I'm your ringside announcer, Anarchist Prisoner Sean Wayne from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max. If you're listening, you are the Resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain, number A243205, OSP Youngstown, 878 Coatesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at SeanSwain.org. If you want to support The Final Straw Radio, you can subscribe to our podcast via various streaming platforms, follow, rate, and share our materials online, and learn more at tfsr.media. And if you'd like to fund our transcription work that allows for easier translation, more accessibility of content, and the zines that we produce for each interview, consider picking up some merch from us or making a one-time or recurring donation via PayPal, Stripe, Venmo, or LibrePay. Or joining our Patreon to access early release content and other goodies via the links that you can find at tfsr.media/support. Finally, if you'd like to hear us on your local radio station, visit tfsr.media/radio to find more info or reach out to us for some help. Thanks for listening. This is The Final Straw Radio. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions and suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or thefinalstrawradio@protonmail.com. If you'd like to use any episode for your project or radio show, feel free to do so. Just send us an email to let us know. If you care to, you can send us letters at TFSR, P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina, 28816. Programming support is brought to you by Firestorm Books. Located at 1022 Haywood Road in West Asheville, Firestorm is a bookstore and social movement space owned by its workers, in operation since 2008. Their event calendar and complete catalog of books can be found online at firestorm.coop.
Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government. Voice of God is government.